The inclination to disregard others is commonly viewed as a flaw in one's social character, an indicator of deficient empathy or a breakdown in communicative abilities. Initially, this assessment appears straightforward and morally justifiable. I have noticed that such an evaluation does not fully capture the essence of these interactions. Ignoring someone does not equate to a mere absence of interaction. Instead, it generates a form of emotional strain or pressure. The emotional impact of having one's attention withdrawn often surpasses that of direct criticism. This observation was not something I had foreseen. Mainstream psychological thought tends to view attention as a neutral exchange medium. Yet this assumption begins to show its limitations when examined in real-world situations. In the late 1990s, Naomi Eisenberger and Matthew Lieberman conducted what would become known as a particularly unsettling social experiment in contemporary psychology. Participants were led to believe they were participating in a digital ball-tossing game with other individuals. At a certain moment, the ball ceases to be directed toward them, effectively excluding them from the game. Brain scans taken during this experiment showed activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, a region typically associated with experiences of physical pain. This was not merely metaphorical pain, but a case of neurological overlap. The researchers interpreted these findings as indicating social distress. The deeper implication is that being ignored elicits a reaction in the brain as an active form of threat. Silence, therefore, is not a passive void, but an active instrument capable of inflicting specific distress. The relevance of this phenomenon is apparent in how many individuals encounter it, not merely as a psychological concept, but as a frequent reality in both professional environments and personal relationships. Examples include a manager no longer responding to emails, a partner reading messages without replying, or a colleague behaving as if one no longer exists. Exit interviews conducted by large consulting firms in the early 2000s revealed that employees found being ignored by their superiors more unsettling than facing open disagreements. One former analyst from a New York firm expressed that the silence made him feel as though his position had already been terminated, despite no explicit communication to that effect. This reaction was neither irrational nor unfounded, but a fundamentally biological response. Commonly, the act of ignoring someone is regarded as a passive action, perhaps unintentional or even a display of politeness. Such an explanation, however, fails to hold up when considering who uses such tactics and under what circumstances. Research into negotiation strategies from the Harvard Program on Negotiation has consistently identified silence as a tool that can shift the balance of perceived power. A party that delays response or withholds acknowledgement often causes the opposing side to over-explain, concede points, or become emotionally agitated. This use of silence creates an imbalance, where one party remains static while the other is compelled to move, resulting in a quiet shift in power dynamics. It is rarely acknowledged that ignoring someone functions as a signal of dominance in primate social structures. Franz de Waal noted this behavior in chimpanzee communities many years ago. Individuals of high status do not need to react to every challenge, while those of lower status are observed monitoring the attention of superiors with great diligence. When a high-ranking chimpanzee ignores another, it is not acting out of apathy, but rather communicating status. Though humans may resist such comparisons, similar patterns can be observed with striking consistency. I recall reading internal training documentation from a major technology corporation from around 2010 that cautioned managers against emotional engagement escalation. The language used was sterile. The practice was clear. One should not reward displays of emotion with attention, but should instead allow them to dissipate without acknowledgement. What struck me was the speed at which this shifted the understanding of ignoring someone from a failure to a strategic tool. Employees subjected to this treatment reported feelings of worry, overthinking, and self-blame, while management saw this as an issue of efficiency. Frequently, official psychology offers the reassurance that emotionally healthy people do not need external support. Though seemingly admirable, this claim disregards available data. Studies on attachment by Mary Ainsworth and those that followed show that even secure adults react strongly to unexplained withdrawal. This reaction occurs not because people are inherently insecure, but because human social interactions are closely tied to survival instincts. When attention is suddenly withdrawn, the brain activates and begins scanning for potential threats. Rational thought processes follow, if they occur at all. This is where the tendency to moralize becomes convenient. By framing ignoring others as impolite or immature, we avoid a deeper investigation of its strategic utility. In reality, systems of power rarely disregard tools simply because they may cause discomfort. Instead, they are rebranded. Silence is redefined as professionalism. A lack of response becomes setting boundaries, and emotional withholding is seen as composure. Each reinterpretation serves to make the behavior more socially acceptable. For most people, the effects of these mechanisms are deeply personal. A subordinate whose communication is ignored does not typically relate the experience to theories of hierarchy. Instead, one is likely to believe that something is personally wrong. Conversations are replayed and behaviors are adjusted as one attempts to repair the perceived damage. All of this effort ultimately serves the interests of the one who remains unresponsive. This is the asymmetry that many analyses tend to avoid. I am uneasy about the minimal intention needed to execute this tactic. Ignoring someone is effective even when the responsible party asserts innocence. The brain of the individual subjected to this treatment does not wait for explanations, but reacts immediately. This immediate reaction gives ignoring someone a unique power, as it does not need aggression, arguments, or justifications, but only restraint. Given that silence can inflict emotional pain, alter hierarchical relationships, and change behavior without physical force, the pressing question is not why it affects us so deeply, but why we so commonly pretend that it is insignificant. By noticing this, you may find that it becomes progressively harder to ignore where silence transitions from accident to calculated strategy. After realizing that silence hurts, the next, more disturbing step comes with realizing why it is so effective. Attention is more than simple social warmth. It behaves like a currency to be given, taken away, and negotiated. Like any currency, the person who controls the supply quietly controls the market. I did not fully understand this until tracking the flow of attention within ostensible meritocracies. In the early 2000s, Roy Baumeister and Kathleen Voss wrote about attention as a limited cognitive resource, and their insights were commonly referenced in discussions on focus and productivity. What is often overlooked, however, is the social undercurrent, especially that the ability to be seen, acknowledged, and answered becomes inherently valuable given the scarcity of attention. A workplace study from 2006 showed that junior employees receiving sporadic feedback from supervisors faced higher stress and exerted more effort relative to those with steady feedback, regardless of the feedback being negative. Silence, counterintuitively, did not demotivate, it spurred action. Platform design reveals this idea. Former Facebook engineers revealed near 2017 how intermittent social feedback proved more effective than constant interaction. The occasional like, encouraged users to frequently check their apps. From a learning perspective, this aligns with variable ratio support, a method Skinner applied to encourage given behaviors. I found it disturbing how easily these findings transferred to human hierarchy. When attention is delivered occasionally, the recipient is more persistent about earning it, even at subconscious levels. For many, this causes instability, an unread message, a contribution overlooked during meetings, a partner becoming less communicative. Usual advice involves disconnecting and diminishing said issues. Empirical evidence points to reactions that do not suggest fragility, but conditioning. One investigation showed that people exhibited higher cortisol when coupled with unpredictable behavior, even in contrast to complete despondency. This implies treatment of unpredictability as a form of extreme threat. From here, this translates to management instead absence. In corporate jobs, powerful figures project control, even temperament. When analyzed, most begin shifting toward the ones who accommodate themselves to be watched. None have power that is spoken or displayed. Once, a human resources consultant revealed how a popular luxury brand aimed to prepare the upper echelons to withhold responses on the terms of internal negotiation, just long enough so that some had to linger and wait. Those who are calm are the ones who win. Popular psychology sees social reciprocation as a given. However, it is a currency of given power, and it translates in that fashion. It makes its withdrawals to have a type of leverage. In many systems, this reflects as a social given while maintaining the first impression. There's a moral concept that many tend to mention, the commonality of it all, overloaded and/or protective. This translates for the silence in a system. If nobody knows what the other is doing and what their intentions are, what benefit comes of said intentions? Psychologists who delve into ostracization acknowledge negative feelings. Not so many analyze compliance. One paper mentioned being compliant regardless of private judgment. It shapes behavior instead of hurting. What I find curious is how many internalize these judgments. The subordinates begin dividing downward. Learning response with who gets delayed. Silence becomes understandable that all people speak to, yet nobody sees. Here an uncomfortable scenario begins with attention. Trade and takes. It stops spending and says that it's a statement of its power. It questions control of the masses because proof points that it does. Is it adaptation or choice? Once attention is seen as a currency, emotions of stopping become rational. It explains unsettling. This does not translate to a character failure. This activates during social exclusion. Eisenberger and Lieberman published a study on magnetic resonance during a simple game of cyberball. People showed activity in the anterior cingulate cortex. It wasn't pain, it was measurable. Not information, but a threat. I was very taken on how it occurred. The players knew of its fabrication. The reaction happened. In workplaces, this looks mild. No criticism and no feedback. Emails get longer, and initiative drops into overcompensation. People were not thinking intelligently. They were thinking defensively. When you're on the inside, it translates to overextended problems. It evolved to oversee. From a loss. Bypassing debates come often, stating one argument and justifying. The brain does not like conflict and hate. Knowing rejection hurts less than not knowing the matter. Self-help shows what attachment looks like. Calm or chaos. This is comforting, long-term and elevated if the responsiveness of someone superior isn't there. The person is stable. It is not smarter because one side is sure. Normal people feel self-doubt. There are no rules and no commands on how to be superior. There is a panic for the matter. This is highly effective due to the deniability of it all. No response to refute and no fault to be stated. Universities do it by decision, suspending explanations, withdrawing, blaming. What's disturbing would be equating the calm and authority for an emotional reaction that's interior. A question looms. What happens to the masses when panic becomes the tool? No one's sure of who adapts and those who choose. Fear takes people and costs almost immediately. If things feel certain, the problems rise again. In negotiation, there is a shift for a time. It signals urgency and leverage. What is rarely said, the statements can be visible. Technology firms rated peers lower if they acted quicker. The perception rose without a decision. Following actions come easy. You adjust and get clarity without position issues. The other side wants to seek resolution. It's shown with dependence. Closure shown by the reactors and not the one who waits. The waiting are authoritative. Comfort and misleading with popular psych occurs often. Transparency is equal and there is trust. But the hierarchy is implicit and emotional transparency may become a fault. Employees are embarrassed to express. Balance is revealed and they're now overaware. The shame is not there. High-ups rarely show themselves from uncertainty. Junior employees are just trying to avoid and sit in one position. This is based on cognitive bias. They stayed quieter because they were busy and the people are emotional. It governs everyday judgment. I am surprised by the consistency of the matter. The justification is insecurity and it backfires. The reactions are scrutinized. Reactions are formative with cost. Rewarding comes with clarity. People learn new positions. A troublesome question will emerge. The ones teaching and not reacting will require insulation to not have had it to begin with. And what restraint stops becoming self-control and starts to turn permanent. Moral comfort loses you and it makes you weak. To be morally pressured causes a lack of strength. And moral comfort is very close with calmness of strategy. Long-term relief is a reward after self-image actions that lead to low income. The reward that comes often at first may not align with the reward at finality. Employees may follow on being polite, but may get dismissed. Restore internal balance. All these shifts leverage away. People praise the values, but give distance to others. The agreeable are rated more slowly. The moral language becomes a lever. Those without status will justify themselves to prove they don't see risk. And by safety with the cost of position, to prove lack of hostility. And don't manipulate. On the inside, strategic is uncomfortable. Even though improved output, the lie happened quietly and didn't make for untrue. It makes mistakes due to emotional availability in symmetrical zones. Does not show gradient of power. Intent isn't there. Behavior lives. In the anterior cingulate and its connection, repairs come for you. Tolerance and not are made not evenly by people. Self-doubt feels a certain high. Nervous identity. No relief and misreading comes to play. Ambiguity often has power and not much addressing to see. People express some and others don't get help there in total. It moves moral upwards with strategic benefit. This shows moral does not mean influence. For being calm, systems punish and people should just know better. The absence of a calm does not show value until people know if the position is kept or not. This says when pressure to be something will allow untouchable people. If morality loses something, detach is cold, not with kindness, but deliberate. You meet with who feels. Emotion is softened by regulation. Suppression creates the impression of being in control. The code has worked. This is clear by seeing loss and experiment. The signal of emotional shows needs. Detachment shows options. These will display replies that take and cannot be chased by tone with closure. The silence does not speak and gets put on a pause. It shows strong. And authorities are viewed with experiments that state the same without effect, but being aware. The bias will proceed. Official psychology frequently stops at identifying detachment as emotional avoidance. But this explanation falters when applied to asymmetric situations. The idea that avoidance stems from fear doesn't always hold true. Strategic detachment can often indicate the opposite, that the relationship, conflict, or opinion lacks the importance to warrant emotional investment. This message often goes unsaid, yet its impact is immediately felt. Consider how corporate conflicts tend to escalate. Internal reviews conducted by major technology firms during the mid-2010s revealed a pattern. Employees who responded emotionally to conflict were more prone to being managed, mediated, or even reassigned. In contrast, those who responded with minimal engagement and selective disinterest were more likely to have their views deferred to. The disagreement might be the same, but the emotional tone differed, leading to different outcomes. From the perspective of those on the receiving end, this feels harsh. Individuals describe feeling frozen out. They find themselves replaying conversations, drafting and redrafting messages, and searching for the perfect words. Their emotional energy escalates, while the detached party's energy remains constant. This imbalance creates a kind of psychological gravity. The more one side invests and pushes, the heavier and more demanding they appear. The less the other side reacts, the more control they seem to exert. It's at this point that moral objections often arise. Detachment can feel manipulative, as if care is being withheld. And sometimes it is. The difficult truth is that systems aren't good at discerning motives. They react to signals. Cold detachment is often interpreted as stability, independence, and the presence of alternative options. Warm engagement, on the other hand, is seen as investment, vulnerability, and a sense of urgency. Even studies on romantic relationships suggest this pattern. Research on attachment dynamics indicates that individuals who regulate closeness by oscillating between availability and unavailability can often gain influence over the direction of the relationship. While this might officially be labeled as insecure attachment, it often translates into control. The label describes the behavior but doesn't negate its effect. I was surprised to observe how often detachment serves as a shield against exploitation. In workplaces where emotional labor is unevenly distributed, those who decline to emotionally soothe others end up less burdened, less frequently interrupted, and less likely to be assigned invisible tasks. Their detachment is often misinterpreted as focus, while others bear the weight of emotional demands. There's a darker side to detachment, its scalability. Institutions use it extensively through automated responses, delayed processes, and bureaucratic silence. No one is shouting, and no one is being openly cruel, yet the individual feels insignificant, powerless, and stuck. The system doesn't need to react because it doesn't have to. In this way, detachment becomes a tool of structural dominance. What makes this behavior potent is that it rarely violates explicit rules. There are no insults, no threats, and no acts of violence. There is just an absence of emotional engagement. Because there is nothing concrete to point to or accuse, the discomfort remains internal. People blame themselves, try harder, and provide explanation for the situation. Paradoxically, detachment requires internal discipline. Studies on cognitive load suggest that maintaining emotional neutrality when provoked requires considerable effort. It isn't indifference, but controlled restraint. Those who can afford the effort, or who have practiced it enough for it to feel natural, gain an advantage. This raises a challenging question. What happens when entire systems are built around rewarding those who feel and express the least amount of emotion? In a world like that, who bears the emotional cost of everyone else's detachment? Detachment works. That's the uneasy conclusion that lingers. However, once someone becomes untouchable and their emotional distance solidifies into a position of power, a different cost begins to surface, not immediately, but quietly. And it almost never appears in books on leadership or seminars about confidence. Psychologists like Dr. Keltner identified this early on. In studies on power and empathy conducted in the late 1990s and early 2000s, participants assigned even minor roles of authority showed a measurable decline in their ability to read emotional cues. They interrupted others more often, misjudged tone, and overestimated how clearly they were understood. Power reduced perceptual accuracy. The theory attributed it to cognitive load. However, it didn't explain why those same people reported feeling more certain than before. Less accurate, yet more confident. That contradiction stayed with me. Being untouchable alters feedback loops. Classic research on organizations conducted at Stanford and Columbia showed that subordinates consistently filtered negative news when communicating with superiors. This wasn't necessarily out of fear, but out of self-preservation. Leaders who conveyed emotional distance received cleaner, less problematic narratives, fewer complaints, and fewer warnings. From an outside view, this might appear as respect. From within, it feels like isolation. One executive described it as walking into a room where everyone is polite and nobody is honest. This has far-reaching effects because detachment hinges on information asymmetry. The more detached you are, the more others control your perception of reality. This isn't paranoia, it shows up in data. Studies on upward communication indicate that employees withhold bad news when they believe leaders value composure over openness. Emotional neutrality discourages emotional risk. Leaders remain calm, and the system becomes quieter, but problems don't vanish. They simply emerge later, often amplified. There's a social toll. Research on ostracism, especially Kip Williams' cyberball experiments, how deeply humans are affected by being ignored. But there's a reverse consequence that gets less attention. People who ignore others begin to lose sensitivity to social pain signals. This isn't because they're inherently cruel, but because repeated non-engagement dulls the mirror systems that track relational impact. Untouchability numbs all parties involved. In corporate environments, this manifests as a peculiar sense of loneliness. High-level managers report fewer genuine conversations, fewer spontaneous interactions, and more performative agreement. A study of senior executives in the mid-2010s revealed elevated stress markers coupled with lower reported emotional. They were shielded from conflict but also from candor. The same detachment that protected them from pressure also insulated them from reality. From the perspective of those lower in the hierarchy, the experience is different. Employees may portray leaders as unpredictable, distant, and hard to read. This ambiguity might create obedience, but it also fuels anxiety. When feedback dries up, people fill the void with assumptions, often overcorrecting, playing it safe, which stifle creativity. The system becomes efficient but brittle, as nobody wants to be the one who disrupts the calm. Romantic and social relationships echo that model. People who cultivate emotional untouchability often report being desired but not deeply known. Partners may express feeling like they're constantly trying to bridge a gap. The detached person feels in control, but also strangely unseen. The dynamic stabilizes, but intimacy erodes. Psychology refers to this as avoidant attachment. The label explains the feeling, but it doesn't explain why the strategy persists. This is where the accepted wisdom breaks. We're told that emotional openness is always healthier and that is always better. But in environments that value performance, certainty, and speed, openness can become a liability. Untouchability becomes an asset, but the price isn't paid immediately, it accumulates. One story that sticks with me comes from a post-crisis review following a major financial collapse in the late 2000s. Several decision-makers admitted that they didn't hear dissenting opinions until the damage had already been done. This wasn't because voices were actively suppressed, but because the leaders were unreadable, with no emotional openings and no signals that disagreement was welcome. This created disaster. The internal cost runs deep. Maintaining untouchability demands continuous regulation, where emotional restraint becomes tied to identity. Over time, people lose track of which feelings are being suppressed and which have simply disappeared. Studies on long-term emotional suppression link it to increased physiological stress and reduced emotional clarity. Whereas you remain composed, you also grow numb. Yet stepping out of that position feels dangerous. Once others adapt to your aloofness, any movement toward warmth might be viewed as weakness or inconsistency. Power can trap its holders. The mask that once protected you becomes the face people trust, making removing it risky to the structure you have built. In this way, emotional distance grants control but erodes the very feedback that keep power aligned with reality. Untouchability feels safe until it quietly disconnects you from the signals that matter. If influence depends on both detachment and accurate, how long can someone stay detached before they lose sight of what they actually stand on? The danger in all of this isn't the presence of anger itself. It's the idea that anger vanishes when you suppress it, detach from it, or rise above it. This illusion fuels systems where anger silently controls everything, while pretending that it plays no role at all. Once untouchability takes hold, the true shifts occur not within the individual, but around them. James Gross's work on emotion regulation in the 1990s revealed something unsettling. Suppression reduces visible emotional expression, but not internal arousal. Heart rate and levels stay elevated. The system appears calm on the outside while burning within. Under controlled conditions, suppressed anger leaked out later as harsher judgments, riskier decisions, and reduced empathy. The accepted explanation framed this as a self-control issue. I think that this misses the larger point. In organizations where anger is punished but pressure is constant, people don't stop being angry. They reroute it. Middle managers become pressure valves, and teams turn on one another. Passive aggression replaces confrontation. One study of hospital hierarchies in the early 2010s showed that units with emotionally restrained leadership exhibited fewer reported conflicts, but experienced significantly higher burnout. The anger didn't disappear, it just lacked a visible owner. This underscores the idea that structure trumps personality. Anger can only control when it's predictable. Social psychologists studying moral outrage, particularly on web platforms between 2010 and 2015, observed that anger spreads more when it feels justified and collective. Platforms learn to amplify it, moderate it, and redirect it, in which anger becomes traffic. Traffic becomes leverage. In this way, nobody needed to feel furious for the system to generate revenue from it. This pattern mirrors in workplaces and relationships. When someone never reacts emotionally, others start reacting for them. They escalate, which test boundaries, or perform outrage to solicit a response. The calm person believes they're winning, but in reality, they've outsourced emotional labor to everyone else. As is, control shifts subtly where the system begins to orbit the one thing that never moves. There's an experiment that rarely gets cited in general psychology. In the early 2000s, researchers studying negotiation dynamics found that participants who showed controlled, low-intensity anger at strategic times got better outcomes than those who stayed neutral. Neutrality was viewed as weakness or disinterest, whereas anger, when delivered in a measured tone, indicates stakes. The conclusion was uncomfortable, as the idea that anger wasn't the enemy of control. Popular wisdom is not just wrong. They just hide the issue and make it worse. We're told to regulate, to calm down, and to not react. However, regulation without structure does nothing more than hide what is under the surface. Systems that truly neutralize anger do something else entirely. They slow down response loops, redistribute power, make consequences visible early, and reduce ambiguity. Anger thrives in environments defined by uncertainty and blocked agency. Remove what feeds it, and anger no longer is power. I saw this play out within a tech company after a wave of scandals in the mid-2020s. Leadership initially doubled down on emotional restraint, which leads to statements with internal rage exploded. Anonymous channels became flooded with messages. Attrition spiked due to emotional distress. It turns out the issue was not the lack of composure of the leaders. It was the systematic lack of transparency throughout the company. Decision logs, clear paths to escalate. The systems made it easy to dissent. Anger dropped as the systems stopped fueling anger. Following those events leads to changes by people within the company. People stop rehearsing arguments in their heads. The relief that replaces tension felt not like moral relief. The end of conflict provides mechanical relief. I hope Machiavelli could see how little things have changed. Power is not suppressing emotions. It is designing environments in which certain emotions stop being useful. Unfortunately, there is the risk of resistance being neutered. Apathy follows frustration and makes protest pointless. That then leads to calm becoming control and silence becoming stability. The question becomes who is profiting from this system. If the operations run smoothly for an extended time, the system should be inspected, as it might be signs of the emotions being externalized. Anger is not an issue only when it is the only indication of an issue. Once the sign is covered up, the issues will still exist. After anger is turned into camouflage, the thing that settles and becomes more quiet. I used to believe the expression of power would be a visible matter. It surprised me to see that the opposite would occur. The thing that stood out to me was the framework of power created by Bertram Raven. The skip step is how stability relies on less emotional forms. Decades later, studies on social status were used to clarify this. The people of higher social standing are not known to speak as often as those of lower, but they will be listened to more. How this materializes in the corporate world is surprising. Strong early opinions resulted in debate and resistance. Withholding until the end got almost no resistance because the teams would fall in line with unset expectations. It is easy to assume this is the work of respect, but it is mostly fear that no one knows where the line can be. It leads to innovation dropping off and anxiety rising due to safety. Intimate relationship parallels this. Often the withholder is the one with the control, as the other party escalates to try and explain themselves. The work becomes put upon the other person. How this has been set up is to put forward emotions can make things appear one way, but that hides the other mechanics at play. Historical examples put this into focus. No longer are leaders as animated, but they hide behind policy. No one can confront, as there is nothing to challenge. There is no need for malice because it will be covered under logic, although it will be used to dominate under the guise of being reasonable. Being in that position gives room to do what you want at a whim. This feeling will turn into insulation. For those who the power is used on, they are worn down. Pushing back is pointless, so nothing happens. The power has been stolen. Newer takes on helplessness teach that unpredictability is just as bad as standard punishment. The rules turn arbitrary, so power can be used effectively without making it too obvious. This allows for modern-day use, as there is nothing to visibly challenge. It makes it hard to push back with little indication of what is going on. Paradoxes come into play when it comes to scales. When no one has any reactions, no one is wrong. Power imbalance becomes undetectable as everything is hushed. Influence starts to become the goal, with its environment closing in on itself. There's a system with people in it dealing with the factors that are never stated. The unquestionable structure replaces the people, which modernizes obedience to process. Consequences of this in the workplace can be measured by the people struggling to put forward their thoughts, because they are too surrounded by conditions. Even personal lives can be an echo. Boundaries are not needed when there are never any needs being stated. Here, conventional emotions becomes warped as control increases, creating a new world. As you start to see that the more absence and silence is used, the more the power of it grows. No longer does anyone confront, and those that do fall into the trap that the controller has set, by the end, the more complete the power, the less visible it appears. If you're able to ignore the triggers, there is still no need for your engagement as the world bends around the machine. Now that you do see, can you step out and avoid deepening hold?